In October of 1997, a 15-year-old boy named John Hartman was beaten to death on the streets of Fairbanks, Alaska. 4 young men, 3 of them Athabascan Indians, were convicted of his murder. Yet years later, the case remains open and unsolved. Who's responsible? How many killers were out on the streets that night? Was racism to blame for these convictions? I'm your host, Matt Ralston, and this is the story of John Hartman and the Fairbanks Four, case of murder on ice. Just days after the brutal beating of John Hartman, which left him unresponsive and lying with his pants around his knees, bridging the sidewalk in the street in downtown Fairbanks, 4 perps had been charged with his murder and sexual assault in uncommonly quick fashion. Their names are George Freese, Eugene Vint, Kevin Peace, and Marvin Roberts. As the Fairbanks Four were taken into custody, luck would have it that John Hartman's older brother, Sean Kelly, would come to encounter them in jail, as he was a regular fixture there. Sean Kelly was understandably angry at the Fairbanks Four. Having no perspective on the circumstances of their arrests, he assumed, like almost everyone else, that they were most certainly guilty. He attacked George Freese, the bad boy, reportedly breaking his nose. Forced to rub shoulders with the guys, he told detectives that Eugene, the youngster, had apologized to him for his involvement in his brother's murder, telling Sean he was there and he did nothing to stop it. He would later claim that Eugene would taunt him, mouthing "fuck you" to him and flipping him off in jail. Angela Harmon was a close friend of Sean Kelly, so she was often in and out of jail as well. She had been present that Saturday evening, October 11th, 1997, when John Hartman's mother answered a knock at the door and police told her that her son was hospitalized and in a coma. Before the end of the month, Angela Harmon had landed in jail again for a probation violation, and she sent word to detectives that she had some incriminating information for them. She had known Kevin Peace, the white boy, for years, and told police she had confronted Kevin on her way back from lunch, demanding to know why he had attacked John Hartman. "We took the punk's money," Peace told her, according to a report taken by Detective Aaron Ring. The truthfulness of this statement has come into question, as she and Kevin were not housed in the same population at the time, given that he's a guy and she isn't, and that she may have had some motive to incriminate Kevin, perhaps wanting to stack the deck to ensure conviction, to make sure he didn't walk due to a lack of evidence. Trent Muller, John Hartman's best friend, who was with them earlier in the night of his death at Noah's Rainbow Inn, would later land in jail too and become cellmates with Eugene at the Fairbanks Youth Facility. It's a small world when you're part of a shady underbelly. Muller testified that he had heard Eugene talking about the crime, saying the same thing that Sean Kelly heard, that Eugene said he was there when it happened. Another jailbird named John Heffel Sr., a 38-year-old roofer, had more than 40 petty, drunk-related crimes on his rap sheet. Heffel recalled Kevin, who he'd become friendly with behind bars, making a brief remark about the murder. He said, "I was fucked up and it was bad," Heffel repeated from the witness stand later that same month. Could they have been that great of friends? Then there was Joshua Bradshaw, 16 years old, who was in jail on charges of felony child abuse, accused of raping a 5-year-old. Bradshaw testified that he'd heard Eugene explain on several occasions that he hadn't meant to kick John Hartman, that the intended target was John Hartman's friend, Chris Stone. After serving a remarkably, almost suspiciously light sentence for sexually assaulting a 5-year-old child, Bradshaw got out. But 13 years later, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison for attempted murder. What happened was, some teenagers had gone to his house to buy an ounce of weed worth $350. Bradshaw handed them the weed, and they didn't give him the money. They ran away and sped off in their car, the oldest trick in the book. As they were leaving, Bradshaw fired a shot, shattering the back window of the car and hitting one of the punks in the back of the head. "You shot me over an ounce of weed. That's not that serious to shoot someone in the head," the disabled victim said to him in court. "Yeah, well, don't steal people's shit. None of this has anything to do with the story. I just think that after Joshua Bradshaw got out of prison, after raping a 5-year-old, you'd be glad to know that he went back, and I think it's funny." If you're like me, you get most of your knowledge about the prison system from television and then pretend you've read books about it when you're in conversation. But you don't have to be an expert on the subject to know that jailhouse snitch testimony is unreliable and problematic for many reasons. People in jail, in prison, have motivation to lie. They may have a beef with the person they're informing on, as it seems like with Sean Kelly and his friends. They might, as criminals often are, be sociopaths without a moral compass who just relish the attention. Or they may hope, or have been told, that their participation could get them benefits, such as a reduced sentence. There's nothing on record of an agreement for Joshua Bradshaw to receive leniency in his child molesting case in exchange for his testimony. The judge found that he had indeed penetrated a child. He was sentenced to 7 years, with all but just over 2 years suspended. 2 years. Would he serve half that? The judge gave only one explanation for his inappropriately favorable sentence. Quote, "assisting authorities." As the trials of the Fairbanks Four neared, the case against them wasn't looking as strong as detectives or the state had hoped. The guys had been charged within 36 hours of their arrest. Speedily, some would even say hastily charged. Marvin, the frontman's car, had been stripped, with dozens of samples sent off to be processed at the crime lab in Anchorage, which detectives expected to yield positive results. There were tire tracks at the scene. Marvin's tires were photographed, with detectives hoping for a forensic match. Inside Marvin's Dodge Shadow hatchback was a .357 caliber Ruger Magnum pistol in a nylon bag. The gun was unloaded, but there were 2 rounds in the center console. That didn't look good. And the tire tracks leaving the scene were the same distance apart as Marvin's car's tires. Police had served warrant on each of the Fairbanks Four's homes. They got all their boots and shoes, jackets, a few cell phones. At Kevin, the white boy's house, they found a bloody shirt and 52 marijuana plants. On one of George, the bad boy's boots, they found a hair. DNA testing did not play into this case because there was no reason for it. There was no blood, no tissue, no semen, or anything else found connecting the Fairbanks Four to the crime scene. There was nothing to be tested. The hair found on George's boot was quickly deemed to not match John Hartman's hair. None of the shoes or boots seized from any of the guys turned up blood or any evidence whatsoever. The blood found on Kevin's shirt was his own, likely from the nosebleeds he'd claimed to have. The pot plants happened to be his mom's. No evidence of the crime was on a cell phone. No fingerprints linking the four men found in the car. No blood on the carpet of the car. Prior to the night of the wedding reception, a relative of Marvin's had borrowed his car for a hunting trip and forgot he left his gun in there. This gun bared no resemblance to the shiny gun that Eugene had allegedly pulled that night, so it was a wash. The tire tracks at the crime scene, which had been driven through by multiple cars anyway, were not detailed enough to match the tread on Marvin's tires. I mean, is that really even possible anyway? This isn't a Bond movie. The tracks at the scene did match the wheelbase of Marvin's car, but that could be said for just about any small car and proved nothing. In short, of all of the evidence the state had counted on having, they had nothing. No physical evidence connecting the Fairbanks Four to this murder. They did have those two confessions. What they needed was something, some lab tests, some miracle, somebody to place George, Eugene, Kevin, and Marvin inside Marvin's car the night of the murder. Anything. Enter Arlo Olson, the only person to see the Fairbanks Four together that night. He said he saw them getting into Marvin's car after attacking Frank Dayton, the guy who was mugged near the wedding reception within minutes of the John Hartman attack. It cannot be overstated how important Arlo's involvement is in this case. Without his coming forward, the Fairbanks Four would have never been sent to prison. And this isn't just my opinion. Prosecutor Jeff O'Brien, the movie buff who's a big fan of Spartacus, stated this at trial.
Simply put, if Arlo didn't see what he saw, and you throw out some other of the state's evidence, the state doesn't have a case. No doubt about it.
I knew Arlo Olson pretty well. His mother was an Athabascan Indian from the village of Caltag. His father was a white guy from Oklahoma. Arlo was lanky, with big expressive eyes, black hair, often in a tight fade, usually dressed the way a lot of Native Alaskans favored, kind of like a 90s rapper. Crisp white t-shirts, some Jordans, a Raiders hat, the type of stuff you can't wear into a dance club in the lower 48. Arlo was a bright guy, but was beginning to show signs of mental illness around this time. He'd often just sit on the stairs of his house by himself, crying uncontrollably. But he could also be funny, manic and excitable with a boyish enthusiasm. I liked him, though I didn't know he was often beating his pregnant girlfriend. Yeah, Arlo was, at the time he came to be involved in the Fairbanks Four saga, to put it lightly, spiraling. Between 1995 and the year 2000, he was convicted 7 times for assaulting the same girlfriend, and twice for assaulting people who wanted to protect her. In 2000, he served time for hitting and choking his mother. A year later, he ended up in jail for punching a woman from the Eskimo village of Untitled. In August 2002, he was arrested for drunk driving. Both of his kids were in the car with him when he drunkenly rear-ended another vehicle. That November, Arlo kicked in his girlfriend's apartment door and held a knife to her throat while threatening her life, effectively kidnapping her for several hours. Troopers were able to rescue her. Now, many of these convictions happened after the John Hartman incident, but still, Arlo had a more formidable criminal record than any of the Fairbanks Four. Yet, he was the one controlling their fate. Arlo became involved in this case almost accidentally. Several days after the incident, Detective Ring rolled up in his cruiser as Arlo and a group of friends were walking in South Fairbanks. Initially mistaking Arlo for someone else, when he figured out who it was, Ring asked him to come to the station to be interviewed since Arlo had been at the wedding reception. He was, however, reluctant to talk to cops. He had 2 current assault charges pending. These were probation violations, and he was looking at the possibility of a year or more of jail time. And maybe him drinking at the reception was a potential violation of the terms of his release. Arlo spent a few days avoiding the issue, but 5 days later came into the station to talk to Detective Ring. Eventually, he would tell him he saw George, Eugene, Kevin, and Marvin beat up Frank Dayton outside the wedding reception and drive away in Marvin's car. This is actual courtroom audio.
I saw him kick 1 or 2 times before I went back in. I didn't see him take off or nothing.
Did you hear anything that they said as they were attacking Mr. Franklin Dayton?
Oh, yes. When he was down on the ground, they said, "Give us what you got, bitch."
Did they really say that, or did Arlo lift that from menace to society? The night of the murder, Arlo walked to the reception at the Eagles Hall with a group of friends, taking pulls off a bottle of Bacardi. They arrived there at the reception. This was a cash bar situation, always a smart move, especially in Fairbanks, and guys were buying mixed drinks for Arlo's younger sister, who was widely regarded as attractive. Arlo snaked a few of her drinks and downed 2 or 3 of them in his words. He also spiked a bottle of Mountain Dew with some more Bacardi and sipped on that for the remainder of the night. Gross. Yet at trial, when questioned on the level of his sobriety and if that could have affected his ability to identify people, he said, quote, "I wasn't drunk. My speech wasn't slurred and I wasn't staggering. I still didn't want to dance." Apparently, whether or not he wanted to dance was Arlo's personal sobriety threshold.
And you had started to feel the effects of the alcohol at this point?
I was high. I wasn't drunk, my speech wasn't slurred, and I wasn't staggering. I still didn't want to dance. Usually I like to dance from a half shot or more.
But you were getting there.
Yeah, I was getting there.
During another court appearance, he threw in the fact that he was also high. I was high, yeah, it was half shot. So to make sure we got that, he was high, as well as having all of this to drink. And depending on the day he testified, he was either totally sober or not. Following the wedding reception, he and a buddy went to the Elbow Room bar. From there, the pair continued to the Alaska Motor Inn, that party that got out of hand, where Eugene the youngster allegedly pulled a gun on the night clerk. While there, with food that was left over from the wedding reception, Arlo started a food fight that led into the parking lot. Then some actual fighting started. You could really make a case that Arlo started all of this. As you may have surmised, Arlo was, in his better times at the very least, a rascal. After talking to Detective Ring, he was either explicitly told or picked up on the fact that the state needed his testimony. Maybe he could skirt his pending assault charges for beating his pregnant girlfriend, charges which could easily land him over a year in jail. At some point, he realized that he may see his time reduced in exchange for giving Detective Ring what he wanted, and he embraced this prospect wholeheartedly and with great vigor. Soon, the state was putting him up in a hotel, and he had some kind of per diem or expense account. He was gloating about this constantly. He bragged to my friends and I about how he was spending all the state's money on dinners and bar tabs, how he was toying with them, giving them little pieces of information to string them along and continue footing his beer money, just making things up, a drunken Machiavelli flying by the seat of his pants. In his words, they were on his nuts. He thought it was precious that the state would need him for something. He spoke of them, of Detective Ring, as being naive idiots. But were they? Arlo gave a statement to Detective Ring on record that he saw the Fairbanks Four attack Frank Dayton. And just like that, the jail time he was facing for beating his girlfriend multiple times disappeared. There were 3 trials of the Fairbanks Four. George Freese would be found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as a separate incident where he pulled a gun on some tourists. Eugene Vint would be found guilty of first-degree murder, not of pulling a gun on a night clerk. Kevin Pease and Marvin Roberts would be tried together, and both were convicted of first-degree murder. Their sentences ranged from 33 to 77 years. 3 separate trials, 4 guilty verdicts. Arlo's testimony was key at all 3 of these trials. While standing outside of the wedding reception under a canopy smoking a cigarette, he would see the Fairbanks Four, acquaintances of his, beat Frank Dayton and jump into Marvin Roberts' blue Dodge Shadow hatchback. He said he was 110% certain it was them. But the question of how, logically, he could have actually seen this baffled a lot of people. His vantage point was quite some distance from where Frank Dayton was mugged. It was after 1 a.m. It was dark outside. This part of downtown is lit with streetlights, but still, it's dark. Arlo never knew the exact distance separating him from the mugging. For some reason, incompetence, I guess, the defense never took a measurement. Testifying at the first trial, Arlo said it was, maybe 100 yards, 150 yards, or about a football field. About a football field. To state the obvious, Arlo couldn't actually see the faces of the 4 guys he identified. That would have required binoculars, he admitted under cross-examination. And he didn't have any binoculars on him. He also wore glasses, but it's unclear if he was wearing them that night. And it was dark, and he was admittedly kind of drunk and high. And there were a bunch of other people standing outside with him, and nobody else saw what he saw. And he never mentioned it to anyone.
And I'm 100% sure of what I saw.
And you're 100% sure?
110%. It's not because of the car. It's because I saw the people.
And that is in the time when they're running back to the car, took about 3 seconds, and you had that glimpse of their faces.
George and Eugene, yeah.
What, pardon me?
George and Eugene, I knew them before. It's like, you see Michael Jordan a half a mile away, you're going to recognize that's Michael Jordan.
It didn't come out until the 3rd trial that police actually had measured the distance and not offered this information up to the defense, which is quite literally withholding information that they were supposed to provide. Indeed, using a roller device, Sergeant James Geyer of the Fairbanks Police Department measured the distance from where Arlo was standing to the parking lot where Frank Dayton was mugged at 183 yards, or 550 feet. Sergeant Geyer had meticulously cataloged every other aspect of his work on the John Hartman case. Yet he left this fact out of his case file, and the defense lawyers found this suspicious. Here he is at trial.
I ran a Rolo tape, I think they call it. 2 wheels on a long stick that measures the distance on the ground from that location. onto what I could as straight a line as possible over to where the area where Frank Dayton said he was robbed and assaulted.
What was the measurement? 50 feet.
Right about 550 feet.
Did you write that down?
Did I write it down?
You didn't report that, but you did.
No, sir.
Why not?
They asked me to go do something, I did it, and let them know what it was, what the results were.
You didn't want us to know about it, did you?
Well, the place is still there, sir.
Just to recap, in case that late 90s audio was a little shaky, asked why he discarded this. He said, "They asked me to go do something. I did it and let them know what it was, what the results were." But he said he couldn't recall who wanted the measurement or who he gave the results to. It probably was somebody with the police department. You think so? Yeah, that would make sense. He added that Arlo's account seemed plausible to him, looking toward the Eagles Hall from Frank Dayton's mugging location. I thought, well, yeah, I could see the place fine, he said. You could see the place. Okay. Is that what we're talking about? It was also dark when Arlo saw the attack happen. Do cops take a lot of measurements in the dark? Also, he should have been looking from where the witness was standing, not the other way around. But what do I know? While researching this case, I kept trying to figure out what I could see from 550 feet away. It's kind of hard to judge, like what's even 300 from 550 feet when you're outside without measuring it. I began to think of where I could do an experiment, trying to match the distance Arlo was standing at and the lighting that night. So I went with my assistant to the University of California, Los Angeles campus one evening, to the Quad, a wide grassy expanse that is exceptionally well lit by street lamps. It was a full moon as well, so this was about the best lighting one could have in a normal outdoor environment. I suspect the lighting is better than Arlo's circumstances provided. I measured off 550 feet. Yeah, okay. I'm recording. Okay. So I've marked off 550 feet. That's the distance that Arlo identified the four guys. It's 7:24 p.m. I'm trying to replicate the conditions of that night as best I can. This is nighttime, but it's very well lit. Very well lit out here with street lights, big lamps. So it's about the most well lit outdoor condition you can have. And I've had my assistant, I'm staring at her now from 550 feet away. I can barely see that she's waving her arms to let me know that we've begun the experiment, but I can make out not a face, barely just a blob of a body, and she's standing right underneath a lamp, right under a big street lamp, 550 feet away in this open space. It's impossible to tell if it's a male or female. You cannot tell hair color. I can see that she has a dark jacket on, and that's really all that I can see. Is just it's just a black blob. It could be a child. It could be a man. It could be anything, but it's impossible to tell. So now I'm walking from the 550 feet toward the mark, getting much closer, and I can barely. So I'm probably half as close now, and so now it looks like a person. I can see a face. It's not identifiable, but it's impossible to even pick out clothing, to identify anyone by posture, face, height, build, in these conditions, which are as close as I could find to the actual conditions. It would be impossible. And this is, I came with my assistant, so I know what clothing she's wearing, and it's beyond It's a joke. It's a complete farce that anyone would claim they could recognize someone from that distance. So, experiment proves conclusively there's no way in hell. Totally bogus. Ridiculous. Could you see me when I was back there?
I couldn't even tell if you existed when you were all the way back there. Like, I couldn't tell if you... You could have just left. You could have just disappeared and been gone, and I would have been stuck here alone. But
Okay, I admit, it's not really my assistant. It's my girlfriend. Here's her perspective on things, just for good measure.
And I'm going to turn around and take a look, and I can't say I see even a person. Let me see here. I mean, it could be a person. When I was back the other way, I actually thought the trash cans were him because it's so far away.
So, recap of very unscientific experiment, but it was, you saw me mark it off, 550 feet, right?
Yep.
Exactly.
I could hardly see you. I mean, for a little while, I could not see you until you came a little closer.
So you couldn't tell what I was wearing?
Nope. Absolutely not.
All right. So what do you think that guy was telling the truth?
No.
Well, there you have it. There's just no way Arlo could have seen anyone from that distance. I couldn't tell if she was a hobbit or an ogre. Could have been Mama June or Manute Bowl. It's just not possible. And I hadn't drank any Bacardi and Mountain Dew yet. The jurors apparently believed him, though, as one quipped, "Every single person that came up to speak for the defense reeked of disbelief. This Arlo guy is either the world's best liar, in my opinion, or he saw what he saw. He was very convincing." It's true, Arlo could be convincing. But could he be this convincing? His word against like 12 other people's? His drunk, high, felonious word? Marvin Roberts' father was an avid hunter. How could you see 500 feet during the evening, in the dark? 500 feet's a long way to see moose. He said jurors from the village would have known better. This is Jeffrey Loftus, a psychologist and memory expert at the University of Washington. He specializes in the accuracy of eyewitness testimony and took the stand for the defense. After apparently having some trouble explaining to jurors just how impossible Arlo's claims were, it later led him to develop new research on the subject. If you're willing to elaborate, I think even the average person understands at this point that eyewitness testimony is pretty unreliable. But how did you feel the need to help people maybe understand that? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I mean, when I testify, in general, I usually testify about how human perception and memory work, and I testify about the circumstances which often characterize the crime at hand, under which a witness's memory in general, and an identification in particular, should be construed as unreliable, and try to get the idea across to the jury that to the degree that a witness's memory is unreliable, it shouldn't be used one way or another in evaluating the identified person's guilt or innocence. So there are various reasons why an identification can be construed as unreliable, one of which is an inability on the witness's part to get very much information about, in this case, what the perpetrator of a crime looks like. And there are many reasons why a witness may not get much information about what a crime perpetrator's face looks like, one of which is they're a long distance away. And in this case, of course, the witness, Mr. Olson, was a long distance away from the perpetrators. And so, yeah, that was obviously a factor that should be considered. And I wished at the time that I had a little more precise way of depicting the effect of being whatever it was 450 feet away from somebody you're looking at on your ability to correctly perceive what they look like.
So this case, this really stuck out to you. Is it fair to say that this wasn't a typical thing and that it did affect you? Because reading your paper, it seemed like you thought about it quite a bit.
I did. I can't remember whether prior to this case there had been any cases I've worked on in which distance was a serious issue, but it sure was in this case. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that looking at somebody from 550 feet away is going to cause problems in terms of being able to see what they look like. And I use that, the foundation was there.
So Sergeant James Geyer, I don't know if you remember him, but he was, along with him and Detective Ring, were the people that had investigated it. And so he ticked it off with one of those roller measuring devices. I don't know what you call them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Basically measuring tape.
Measuring. Yeah, that's what you should call it. And it's 550 feet. So 550 feet is a very long way, as anyone could tell. In the dark. And even if there's street lights, it's still dark outside. So Arlo's testimony was that he could make out the sort of, I guess I'm paraphrasing, the persona. So his quote was, well, if you saw Michael Jordan from that far away, you could still tell it's Michael Jordan, not necessarily by his face, but just his sort of, his build and his mannerisms.
Yeah, I don't even think that's true. I mean, obviously, the general point is well taken in that I was talking about facial recognition, and it's also possible to recognize people by, body shape and gestures and stuff like that. But still, to say that a body shape is unique the way a face is incorrect. I mean, there are many people who have more or less the same body shape. So, if there you saw somebody from 550 feet away and you said, oh, that looks like Michael Jordan, maybe it was, but maybe it was, some other tall, well-built guy, and not Michael Jordan.
Yeah, I mean, based on which is the entire reason that you did this particular study, I'm curious if you did one factoring in body, just the entire body, it would almost seem less accurate because I don't know, I can't really explain. I'm trying to make sense of it and I'm having a hard time.
Yeah, right. I mean, no, I haven't done any experiments factoring in bodies.
But from that far away, maybe if someone was 800 pounds, maybe you could make it out in the dark from that far away, but
you could, right. So, yeah, clearly there are extreme body types that would be useful in terms of identifying a person. But so there are two ingredients to this assertion. The first is that the visual system isn't as affected by sort of global features of a scene like height or build as it is by detailed features like the collection of features that make up a person's face. And, it's easy to understand this if you imagine blurring a picture of a person, the information about the person's face would be lost, but the information about the person's height and build wouldn't be lost, at least nearly as quickly. So there's that, and the other sort of component is that you recognize people on the basis of whatever features of them distinguish them from anybody else. So as I say about Michael Jordan, if you see a tall, well-built basketball player-looking guy under poor circumstances, you might believe he's Michael Jordan. But what you've really done is to restrict the field of possible people to anybody who has more or less the same body shape as Michael Jordan. And there are dozens of NBA players that would fit that description. And let's imagine, though, that you happen to know a guy who's, 5'8" and weighs 350 pounds. That's a very unique body shape. Let's suppose the guy's, all the guy's weight is mostly concentrated on a huge belly that he has sticking out under his belt. So there aren't very many people in the world who would fit that description. So even if under adverse circumstances you saw a guy who looked like that, you'd be more justified in identifying him as this 350-pound guy than you would identifying a NBA-looking guy as Michael Jordan.
You remember that juror who said that Arlo may have been the world's best liar? Well, it turned out later that he probably was lying, or else he was lying about lying, or else he was lying about that. It became kind of ridiculous. The trials of the Fairbanks Four wrapped in 1999, and a year later, Arlo was back in prison for a series of the violent offenses mentioned earlier. He began recanting his statement identifying the Fairbanks Four to anyone who would listen, including an attorney for George Freese and Detective Aaron Ring. This prompted a hearing on the matter, where Arlo told a judge he was lying when he retracted his statements the first time. He stood by his initial statement, kind of. This kind of makes sense. We know Arlo was in a lot of danger in prison. It was widely believed in the Native community that his testimony had landed 3 innocent natives and 1 white honorary native behind bars. There were a lot of people who wanted him dead, including members of the Native Brotherhood prison gang. Yet, if he retracted his statements, he could be guilty of perjury. It seemed his whole master plan was unraveling before his eyes. He was pretty screwed either way. A journalist who's written extensively on the Fairbanks Four named Brian O'Donohue recorded several phone calls he had with Arlo from prison a few years later. Arlo didn't know he was being recorded, but that didn't matter. In Alaska, it's legal. You'd think that with Arlo believing he was engaging in a private conversation, there might be some clarity on his wavering. But no, he's still just all over the place. He says that Harley Simikin knows what happened, and repeats a rumor that had been going around that Eugene had confessed to his mom when he was on the phone in jail. He says he thinks the Fairbanks Four are guilty, that he saw them beat up Frank Dayton. Then all of a sudden he says if he had to take the stand again, he would testify on their behalf. He's still apparently just in the same mode of thinking in terms of whatever's best for himself. This would be exemplified later in court in 2003 as he was being sentenced for yet another crime. He brought up his own testimony regarding the Fairbanks Four.
I did what I thought was my civic and patriotic duty. Most of all, I did what I thought was right. My life has been continuously threatened, and I have been harassed for the past 4 years. I did not know that testifying in that case would change my life so much. I did not know the repercussions would be so severe. The DA did not tell me I'd be so afraid for my safety and the safety of my family The DA did not tell me I'd be so scared, worried, and stressed. Most of all, the DA did not tell me I'd become an outcast to the Native society. No longer am I welcome at Native gatherings, functions, places of work, and homes. The friends I had and people I knew have abandoned me because I was the state's witness and testified against 3 Native defendants. Since my incarceration, that fear and threats have been increased to where it is not tolerable any longer. Your Honor, I know what I did that unforgettable day was selfish. I know my actions that day were wrong. I now know that I cannot ever drink or use drugs again. I now know that I need to stay on my meds and get the counseling that I need. I now realize all of my mistakes I have made and all the people that I have hurt, especially my children and their mother. I have hurt them the worst. I've taken myself out of my children's lives. No longer do I hear their voices or get to watch them play. No longer do I get to see them grow. I miss my babies so dearly, Your Honor.
The judge was not moved, citing no improvement in Arlo's behavior, just escalation, increased frequency, more crimes. He sentenced him to 4.5 years in prison. Some concerned citizens from the town of Tanana, where Marvin Roberts' family originated, later pointed out something troubling about Arlo's testimony that all the attorneys had apparently missed. He had stated that earlier in the night before John Hartman was murdered that he'd seen the Fairbanks Four in Marvin's car, and that George in the back seat leaned out the window and asked if he wanted to get high. But Marvin's Dodge Shadow was a hatchback. The back windows didn't roll down. For anyone in the back to lean out the window, they'd have to be smushing the front passenger's face into the windshield. Even then, it would have been difficult to poke their head out. In 2017, Arlo was found unresponsive in his jail cell. He had committed suicide. A memorial was held for him in the village of Caltech, where his mother's side of the family was from. Melanie Durham, the woman who heard the attack from the balcony of the women's shelter, testified that she'd heard the sounds of, quote, flesh, smashing flesh, and that she'd heard a native accent that sounded angry. Durham was then asked if she could make out any of the words that the voice was saying. She could not. How then did she know it was a native accent if there were no words? She was asked. Good question. Beyond that, it's important to realize that all the Fairbanks Four are from the city of Fairbanks. 3 of them are Alaskan natives, but none of them have a native accent, any more than I do. To state the obvious, nobody credible actually saw the Fairbanks Four anywhere near John Hartman. What I really don't understand is, Arlo had pinned them as having beat up Frank Dayton and then driving away. But Frank Dayton was alive. He wasn't even beaten up that badly. John Hartman had no connection to him. He was found several blocks from there. Let's just say the Fairbanks Four did assault Frank Dayton. Couldn't a competent lawyer get them off of having beat up John Hartman? Especially when everyone knew there were fights downtown all the time? That this was a crazy drunken night with all kinds of things happening? All kinds of people out and about? Were the Fairbanks Four responsible for every crime downtown that night? I mean, what is reasonable doubt, if not that? The Fairbanks Four were charged with murder in October. The following August, nearly a year later, Chris Stone, John Hartman's dirtbag friend, the last guy that saw him alive on record, serving time at the Fairbanks Youth Facility for his part in binding a rape victim, sent for Detective Ring. This was after the Fairbanks Four had been charged, but before they were tried and found guilty. You remember Chris Stone, right? He was hanging out with John Hartman the night he died. The guy who was high on methamphetamine and Wellbutrin. It says he doesn't know what happened, even though he was seen walking with John Hartman 15 minutes before he was attacked. The guy who then, immediately after the time John Hartman was attacked, rushed into a grocery store, freaked out, making a scene. Well, suddenly all these months later, Chris Stone remembered something. And it was not favorable to the four guys being charged with John Hartman's murder. At first, he had seen Kevin's photo in the newspaper, but he didn't recognize him. But now he's seen the photo in color on the front page, and this has jogged his memory. He says he saw Kevin standing next to Marvin's blue car in the parking lot of the grocery store that he ran into that night, frightened. The blue car is an important detail, as it puts Kevin as being in Marvin's car. Remember, Kevin had been in a blue car that night. It's the car of Kevin Bradley's mom's, a blue Nissan. Detective Ring wants to make sure that Chris Stone hasn't heard this somewhere and he's just repeating it, that this is his genuine memory, which would be hard to prove given that everyone at this point knows what kind of car Marvin had. And Chris Stone has admittedly been reading the fucking newspaper. Is Chris Stone trying to cast guilt on the Fairbanks Four? Because there's an awful lot of suspicion on him. Maybe. What if they're acquitted? Wouldn't he be next in line to be charged? It would benefit Chris greatly for them to be guilty. He could be done with this. Ironically, in this interview, Detective Ring is telling Chris Stone that there are a lot of rumors that he was there when his buddy was beaten to death, that he saw what happened. Yet, he doesn't really care. He's already got the four guys charged. What's nearly certain is that Chris Stone knows more than he has let on. He had a lot of enemies. He'd been jumped himself recently, a few weeks before John Hartman. Were these things connected? We'll explore Detective Ring's interaction with Chris Stone, as well as some damning evidence against the Fairbanks Four. Next time on Murder on Ice. If you have any information on these crimes, contact your local law enforcement or email alaskapodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at Murder on Ice, on Instagram at Murder on Ice, on Facebook, Fairbanks Podcast. Follow me on Twitter, the Matt Ralston. Follow me on Instagram, the THE Matt Ralston, MATTRALSTON. Please tell a friend and rate and review on Apple Podcast. It takes about a minute. Huge thank you to Professor Jeffrey Loftus from the University of Washington, my alma mater. Written and produced by me, Matt Ralston. Music by Arlo Sanders. Please rate and review us on iTunes. I know I already said that, but, I don't want to keep doing this for free, honestly.